Welcome to English 212A. I want to give a little bit of a lecture on Captain John Smith. I hope you've had a chance to look at the text and the introduction. I posted a little link for Peggy Lee's Fever, and in that song from the 50s, she sings a little bit about Captain Smith and Pocahontas, emphasizing a myth about Pocahontas and John Smith. Peggy Lee sings, Captain Smith and Pocahontas had a very mad affair. When her daddy tried to kill him, she said, Daddy, oh, don't you dare. He gives me fever, fever with his kisses, fever when he holds me tight. Fever, I'm his missus, oh, Daddy, won't you treat him right? That song emphasizes this idea that Pocahontas was madly, deeply in love with John Smith and rescued him. We'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll give a little bit of background on John Smith. Some of this is covered in the little intro in the Norton introduction. I'll just give a little more. He was born in England in 1580 in rustic Willoughby by Alfred Lincolnshire to an affluent farmer, and he was an ambitious son. He was indentured to a merchant as an apprentice, but eventually he got that broken and he fled to the Netherlands to fight against Spain. And when he returned to England, he emphasized how he wanted to train in all things martial. He became an expert horseman. He studied Machiavelli's art of war. He became an explosives expert, and he studied military history a lot. Later on, he joined the Austrian forces in fighting against the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and during some of that he was an expert with bombs, what he called fiery dragons. Eventually in 1602 he was captured, became a slave to Turks. Eventually he resisted, supposedly killing his master and then making it back to England. And in 1606 he joined the company that was going to work on establishing Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement. The Roanoke settlement, which had happened a decade earlier, pretty much died out. It's mysterious, like whatever happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. When he was in Jamestown, he was pivotal in helping the colonists survive. The colonists were not very well organized, were not very industrious, and when he took charge, he instituted a policy of you had to work if you wanted to eat. He also helped with sanitation. He dispersed some of the members of the colony so that they wouldn't have as much disease, as much sickness, and he was really instrumental in getting food. Getting people to plant food and that sort of thing too, but cutting deals with natives so that the Jamestown colonists could have some food. The narrative itself is pretty wild. There's a lot of like him running around, getting captured, a lot of like posturing, him trying to understand what's going on and that sort of thing. Some biographers claim the essential accuracy of his narrative, but a lot of people have been really skeptical about that. When Pocahontas supposedly saved John Smith, she would have been very young. And she was really important in helping the colony too, because she helped bring food to the colonists and that sort of thing. And then it was much later that she married one of the colonists, John Rolfe, and would eventually go to England and hang out in court. John Smith himself only spent 3 years in the Americas. And he was an admirer of Spanish conquistadors. He really admired Cortez, and he believed in being aggressive and not being a pacifist at all. His attitude was pretty much don't mess with John Smith. And he was pretty much a badass. He was a little fighting guy. who was very tough. In the little section, I'll click on it right here too. My arrow is here, around here. In the text, this is probably the most famous section of John Smith's narrative. He has been captured, held by Powhatan. They've been feeding him. At one point, he's a little paranoid that they're trying to fatten him up, and he's afraid they're going to eat him. And so it's this kind of like mythic sort of thing that he's hanging out with the cannibals. I think a lot of this is sensationalism to try to appeal to his English audience. But I'll read a couple of these paragraphs and we'll look at them a little closely. At last they brought him to Werowokomoko. And it's interesting that this narrative is in third person, even though he's behind writing it. And there is a little belief that some of this was written by other people too, but it's also hard to figure out how some of those people could have written it because they didn't see all these things. But so I'll keep going. Where was Powhatan, their emperor? Here more than 200 of these grim courtiers stood wondering at him as if he had been a monster, till Powhatan and his train had put themselves in their greatest braveries. Before a fire upon a seat like a bedstead, he sat covered with a great robe made of raccoon skins, and all the tails hanging by. On either hand did sit a young wench of 16 or 18 years, and along on each side of the house 2 rows of men, and behind them as many women, with all their heads and shoulders painted red, many of their heads bedecked with the white down of birds, but every one with something, and a great chain of white beads about their necks. A question I have to ask you is, what do you think of when you think of mighty big Powhatan sitting in something that might be like a throne with this great robe of raccoon skins and all the tails hanging from it? It's kind of a really interesting image. Some like really big guy with a big fuzzy fluffy coat and all these gigantic Daniel Boone kind of raccoon skins hanging from him. It is a kind of like mythical image that has really garnered attention. I think that some people looking at this, thinking about it from a modern perspective, would say like, I don't know, that's like pretty flashy. That seems kind of like a big fluffy pimp coat. And then also the way that John Smith emphasizes that there were a bunch of young women sitting around him too would go along with that kind of image of Powhatan. And then it's a little farther down when it seems like Powhatan was thinking about killing John Smith. So they feasted him, seemed like they got him ready. And then here's the part where they seem like they're going to do something to him, and John Smith is getting nervous. Some people resist that this even really happened, but we'll read it and think about it. Then as many as could laid hands on him, dragged him to them, and thereon laid his head, and being ready with their clubs to beat out his brains, Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, when no entreaty could prevail, got his head in her arms, and laid her own upon his to save him from death, whereat the emperor was contented he should live to make him hatchets and her bells, and so on. And so this is the big famous moment of Pocahontas intervening to save John Smith. And the way it seems John Smith wants us to read this, the way he kind of promoted it, the way a lot of people have read this and thought about it is they think that Pocahontas adores John Smith. She loves this great white warrior man and is pretty much saying like, Daddy, don't hurt him. John Smith is implying that he's a ladies' man, and this daughter who was a favorite of Powhatan wanted to step in and protect him and help him. And you could even say that this image of Pocahontas as some sort of like symbol of America, of Native America, in a gesture, is kind of like saying like, we need to help the white people. She's attracted to the white guy. She loves the white guy. And so this is kind of like a fulfillment of some like white colonial fantasy, that they're irresistible, that Native women like them, that in some ways this may imply that white guys, white colonizers belong here. You can parallel it to the way La Malinche helped Cortez overcome the Aztecs and the royalty. There was this kind of resistance. And so she was a native woman who identified with colonizers. This idea of a woman in some ways representing America also gets mirrored in Amerigo Vespucci's famous engraving of, or it's actually by Theodore Gall, but it's the engraving of entitled Amerigo Vespucci, Discovering America. And so there you have this woman representing America, and you have Amerigo Vespucci, who may think he's some sort of ladies' man. He thinks that he's going to connect somehow to this native woman, but that image is full of lots of ambiguity. The John Smith story is much more of a kind of wish fulfillment, a fantasy. One way that people read the supposed scene of Powhatan getting ready to execute John Smith is that he wanted to scare the crap out of John Smith and make him realize that Powhatan could take his life at any time. He had power over him. And then he wanted John Smith to be grateful that he had been spared. And then also, because Pocahontas was his daughter, some people think that he wanted him to believe that he was indebted to this young woman, and through her to Powhatan. Some people read it as an exercise in Powhatan gaining authority over John Smith. John Smith didn't really interpret it that way. Also, some people interpret it as a strange, elaborate ceremony of bringing John Smith into the tribe, as if they want to kill his English identity and then remold him as a native, telling him that he had to be loyal to Powhatan. Those are a couple ways that people interpret it, and this doesn't seem to be the way that John Smith interpreted the episode. John Smith considered himself to be one of the greats when it came to being a man of action. And so I'm going to sign off. And have a good week. I hope you enjoy the text, and I'll talk to you soon.